Good morning, everyone. Guten Morgen, Vanakkam. It is my great pleasure this morning to introduce again our author Ronya Othmann to you. She's a young German writer and journalist who regularly publishes in German newspapers and currently lives in Leipzig. She created quite a stir with her text 74, which won the Audience Award at the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize, a very prestigious German literary award, while the audience decided not to judge it. The question was, can documentary writing be considered as literature or not, which I think is a topic maybe we also need to speak about. Is there a line between those two genres, or should there not be? Today we're going to speak about her novel Die Sommer in German, The Summers in English, which was published in 2020 and has been translated into English. Her collection of poetry, which is called Die Verbrechen, unfortunately hasn't been translated yet, but we are waiting for this to happen soon. Welcome, thank you so much for joining. Yes. We thought Frau Othmann is going to read from the novel, because I'm not sure if you've all had the chance to read the novel beforehand. So she's going to read a short extract, and then we're going to start a discussion first amongst the two of us, and then I'm happy to open it up if you have questions in the last 10-15 minutes. With this, I hand over.
Yeah, thank you so much first for the invitation also. And I will read an extract from the beginning. So I don't explain anything first. No, it's fine. On the main road, there was a sign with flaking letters that formed the name Tel Khatun. The sign was cocked-eyed, perhaps because of the wind. Just a few meters past it, a narrow gravel line branched off from the main road. It led past garden fences into the village. The village used to have a different name. It had only been called Tel Khatun since the time when all other villages and cities in the region had also been given new names. It was just one of many villages between Tibesbi and Ramelan, and that nobody just wandered into, one you only went to if you knew the people who lived there. Leila could walk down the lane to the village in her mind, 10 steps from Tel Khatun's metal sign to where the lane branched off, then 15 steps to her grandparents' garden, and then between her grandparents' garden and their neighbor's garden, 300 steps on the gravel line, where most of the time the chickens were already coming toward you, and then past the left side of the fountain to her grandparents' house. Her grandparents' house stood at the entrance to the village, its garden poking into the landscape like a long green tongue. If you walked past the olive trees, orange trees, flower beds and tobacco plants as far as the rear wire fence, you could look back to the main road you had come from. All around were fields, and beyond the fields a mountain range rose in the distance, the Turkish border. If Leila had not known what was happening on the border, she might have thought the mountains were beautiful. The house was made of the same clay as the landscape, even having the same color. Admittedly, Leila had only been to the village in the summer. From her father, she knew that in springtime the country was covered in green, there were far more plants blooming, and the ground was damp and clumpy. The grass only faded over the course of the summer months, under the hot sun, the heat dissociating the earth and the wind pushing more and more dust before it. Every year, the more the summer advanced, the more desolate the landscape became. Leila had spent entire days lying on the thin foam mats in the house, staring at the ceiling. The ceiling beams were thick tree trunks whose boughs had been cut and their bark shaved off. Above the beams was the vaulted straw, and above the roof was sealed with layer of clay, so that no rain could seep in. The windows were small and deep, the walls thick in order to keep out the summer heat and the winter cold. There were only 2 narrow doors. The metal one led to the courtyard in the street, the wooden one to the garden out back. Many years ago, the village men had gathered to build the house. They had fired bricks out of clay, they hauled and stacked them, they worked for 3 days until the house was finished. Chickens lived in the courtyard next to the house, as in all village courtyards. Their dropping lay sprinkled everywhere on the dusty ground. 2 lofts stood up there on tall, narrow metal feet. Those were the summer beds. In winter, they slept on the wool mattresses and rugs inside the house. The house was not large, just 2 rooms in a small corridor. There was no furniture, just pillows on the floor with holes in their covers and thin mattresses. The walls were painted white, but the paint was flaking off, revealing a mixture of clay and straw that had been smeared over the fired bricks. Hanging from the ceiling in the middle of both rooms were large fans that spun incessantly throughout the summer. On her grandparents' property, there were smaller houses not meant to be lived in. The kitchen and the shower were in one of them, in another the pantry. There was a hut for the chicken, another one for the bees. The village was flat as the landscape surrounding it. Only in the village center was a hill for the dead. It wasn't really a hill, but more of a small mound. Layla wondered if this hill had been constructed by people, or if the people had chosen it in order to build their village around it, or if it had slowly grown up, swelling from generations of the dead that had been buried there over the course of the centuries, for there were such hills in the other villages too. Grandmother called dying the day you changed your clothes. Layla imagined all the dying people being handed freshly washed clothing made of coarse material the color of the earth. Her grandmother's phrase about the day when you changed your clothes popped into her mind again suddenly as she walked down the empty street. It wasn't raining, but the air was damp. The arrival board of the streetcar showed 5 minutes. Beside her, there were 3 men waiting. One sat at the bench and typed something into the phone. The other was wearing an orange safety vest and held a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. The third just stood there, smoked, and stared into space. They didn't even turn their heads when Layla joined them. The minutes on the destination board fell from 5 to 4, from 4 to 3, from 3 to 2, from 2 to 1. Then the streetcar arrived. Layla put on her backpack again. You always tell a story from its end, she thought, even if you start with the beginning. Every summer, they flew to the country where her father had grown up. The country had 2 names. One of them could be found on maps, globes, and official documents. The family used the other one. Both names could be assigned their respective territory. If you laid these territories on top of another, they overlap. One of the countries was Syria, the Syrian Arab Republic. The other one was Kurdistan, their country. Kurdistan was located inside the Syrian Arab Republic, but extended beyond its borders. It had no officially recognized frontiers. Her father said they were the rightful owners of the land, but in spite of that, were only tolerated and often not even that. Later, Layla would look in vain for Kurdistan in the school atlas. The Europeans are to blame, her father said, and cracked a sunflower seed between his teeth. To be more precise, France and Great Britain, when they divided it among themselves on the drawing board with a pencil and a ruler 100 years ago. Since then, our country extends across 4 states. You must not tell anyone the name of the country, her father said. When someone asks you where you were going, then you tell them to your grandparents' house.
Thank you. You might have noticed that the description is very detailed. How many steps does it take from one side to the other? How does the house look? How has it been built? So your entire novel revolves around the question of memory and how memories can be preserved if everything else is already lost. It doesn't exist anymore. So my first question would be, where do you see the responsibility in literature to keep memories alive?
Yeah, the novel is also about memory because it tells the story of Layla, the protagonist. She grew up in a German Kurdish Yazidi family, and she visits in the summer holidays. She visits her grandparents in the village in Syria, the Kurdish village there. And as you know, 2011 there was protests against the Assad regime, and the war in Syria started. And Layla's family is from a Yazidi Kurdish minority, and they like when the religious fundamentalism grew, it went worse for the Yazidi. And then 2014 we had in Syria and Iraq we had the genocide on the Yazidi people by ISIS. So, and then her grandparents, her grandmother will leave the country then and become a refugee. And so, like the Yazidi world, when she tells, like the story is told from the beginning, but it's somehow also the end. So memory becomes more important because, like, the Yazidi life in northern Syria and also Iraq is not the same after 2014. So, like, the memory becomes important, like the little details of the daily life, which when you are living it seems not that important, but when you lose it, then it becomes important somehow. And it's also about the Yazidi culture, because there is a big, many Yazidis left their homeland, so and they came to Europe, and so it's somehow the culture also changes, and also it's an oral tradition, so a memory becomes very important, and to memorize things and to carry your home in the language somehow. Yeah.
I would ask one follow-up question, because I introduced you with the debate, documentary writing, fictional writing. If you look at this opening, would you differentiate and say this is actually a document of memory, or would you say this is fiction, or would you say it's both and I don't need to choose?
No. So I think it's both. And also I think memory is always fiction. Because the language is in which language you memorize something, it becomes fiction. So if you start with this detail, or you start a sentence with this and that, and the words you choose, so it becomes fiction. So I think it's both, but the story also, I worked with, there are many videos, and later on when the war starts and Layla watches TV, and she's in Germany in safety, but she sees the war and the massacres on TV and in the internet, and so this is like the videos and clips she watches, you can find them on this. So it's somehow also documentary details, and the village also is the same village as my grandparents' village. So there is some kind of documentary, but Layla for me is like a bit like a camera, like she just she sees everything, and you explore you go with her from Germany to Syria and back, and yeah.
The Layla, who is very young when she travels to the grandparents, her favorite person is her grandmother. Like, the summer starts with her hugging her grandmother very tight, and then everyone in the village makes fun of her because she follows the grandma like a little duckling, not willing to leave the grandmother. The grandmother comes from a community of oral tradition, and she also explicitly explains why that is so, telling her granddaughter that stories that are in your head can never be used as evidence against you. So I was wondering how you personally navigate between an oral tradition and your aim to share those stories of unheard communities, to make them part of the official narrative and also make them accessible to a wider audience, which is not possible if they stay in an oral tradition, which automatically has like a very limited radius.
Yeah, I talked a lot with people from our community when I wrote the novel. So I recorded also like the stories my father told me, and it was some kind of research for me also. And it's the thing is that they're from this Yazidi Kurdish background, also in the book, and they are living in Syria, which is until today a dictatorship. And to have books or to read certain books could be dangerous for once. So there's a story when it's also a story that happened. Like my father had forbidden books, and it's also in the book. Then Layla's grandmother, and also that's a true story. My grandmother, she could not read and write, and she buried the books because she was afraid that someone will see them. And it's also like they're from a Kurdish, they were Kurdish books, and the Kurdish language was like, you could not speak the Kurdish language officially. In the village they spoke Kurdish, but officially it was not, like even if in the TV, when they, I heard this, like they have a little clip about a marketplace in a Kurdish city, and they could not send it because people spoke Kurdish then and was not allowed to speak Kurdish publicly. So that's also a thing. So the Yazidi are very like they lived like in these rural places in the villages because there's a long history of discrimination, and so they kept also their traditions secret somehow long time, and it's also like the holy text, for example, it's not written down, so there are some families who are responsible to memorize them. So that's also, it plays a big role, and you cannot, so if you carry it on a tongue, nobody can finds them, so you could keep it secret. Yeah.
Have you ever considered that your book might become part of the oral tradition and just continue on in this, or do you think those are to a certain degree separate worlds?
I think I think maybe like from the oral tradition, I think the book, when it's written down, it's also like there is this version. And in the oral tradition, there are sometimes more versions of a story. So sometimes I'm also jealous. I think I consider them as like there's this Denkbeige tradition, like they're like oral writers, but they don't. Mm-hmm. I think it's also they are writers, but like they tell the stories orally. So
it would be an adaptation, kind of. Okay. The story of your main character, Lila, is the story of someone who, like all of us, inherits her father's history, but her father's history is the one of a traumatizing migration and not a voluntary migration. And it's just the last in a family line where it has happened in every generation that people had to move, people had to shift, people had to flee. So this memory stays with her, and as long as we as the readers get to stay with Layla, she's kind of caught between the two worlds. The Germany she grew up with, the student life, the party, whatever we expect, and her family very closely knit, which has completely different realities and also different reference systems, kind of. And I was wondering, I mean, Germany is a country with a very huge population that has a migration background. Do you feel that it needs more stories like this to create awareness, but also to make people sympathize and understand the realities, what it actually means to be between two wonderful cultures?
Yeah, I think it's when I wrote it, then sometimes there were some young women, because it's like the Yazidi culture is a very like so my family is a bit exception because my mother is German and my father is Yazidi, but like the average Yazidi, they don't marry outside the culture. So, and that's because we have like the biggest Yazidi community, not as in the world, is like not anymore at home, is in the diaspora, is in Germany. So, but in Germany it's like a Western country and they go to school and they study, and so that's also a challenge for the families to keep somehow their tradition, and sometimes it's also very conflict, there are many conflicts, and also it's especially for women sometimes not easy. And for example, a story we have, like when the first Yazidis came, there were weddings and the skirts were long, and now this someone told me the skirts became shorter and shorter every year. No. So the culture changed, but it's not like, it's also sometimes a conflict between the generation and yeah. And when I wrote it, and I had some presentations with the book, and then young Kurdish and also Yazidi women, they came, yeah, we are Layla. They told me like, we are Layla, we because she has this conflict also in the novel, yeah, between the like also somehow, yeah, to have trouble with some tradition or some kind like it's like, I think it's a double thing. It's like I think the German culture is very, like in Germany, the Western culture is very, the individual is individualistic. It's very important with the individual, and the Yazidi culture is more communal. But this communal can also be like lack of freedom, but you feel somehow held by the community. So it's in the Western society sometimes it's freedom, but still you're left alone somehow. So it has good and bad sides. So, and then it's not easy for Layla to navigate between this, and for many many migration families. Like, it's not only the Kurdish and the Yazidi. I think it's in many cultures like this. So, yeah.
Do you feel that in German literature those stories are by now represented?
Yeah, I think so. So yeah, because of like Germany is an immigrant country, and immigrant came, and then we grow up with German language, went to school, so they start also to write, and since like years and years, and we have many German authors who write in German language, but have like a so-called migration background. And I think the good thing in literature, it can also like tell complexes, like the like the complex world somehow, and complex realities, and not the ambiguity, for example, and not like it is in the political discourse. You have, it's very either way, and it's very like simple, but the reality is not that simple. And then when you write a novel, you have like, it's contradictory figures. And Layla is also, I think she's very, she's sometimes also a problematic figure sometimes,
That is actually one aspect I found very interesting, because you already said that sometimes it's hard for the women because the traditions are so different, and you choose to address the gender topic in especially the second part of the novel, where Layla is in Germany and openly lives a queer life, but it's very obvious that this cannot be part of her entire life. This is kind of the German side of her life. And I was really interested because in Germany the whole gender debate, gender identities, gender expectations have been instrumentalized in the migration debate. This is often, they are like this, we are like this cannot be combined. So I was very interested to hear more about why you choose to focus on this as well.
Yeah, I think it's part of the reality, and it's also like Layla has like, there is, she's confronted with many parts, many layers of reality somehow. There is this migration story, or maybe it's migration is not the right word because her family they came as refugees, so they went they were forced to leave. So her grandma, but still but the gender aspect is also part of her life, or it's also like her family in Syria living under dictatorship, and like there are many layers which are part of the reality. So it's I could not like didn't want to leave that alone because it makes things more complex, and but still also it's instrumentalized in Germany also by the right wing, but they're like there are many they became famous, the Kurdish fighters who fought the women on the front line who fought ISIS. So and they went to the battlefield. So we have also it's not that like as it seems often like there are also like feminists coming from different cultures, and in Germany sometimes like the right wing they don't they use this gender debate.
Did you question if that is something that could be part of your book, or if it could be read as offensive by anyone, or was that something, like you said, it's part of the complexity of any the gender aspect?
Yeah, I was afraid a bit because it's a big taboo, but there are also some other taboos. For example, in Syria, inside the Yazidi community were suppressed by the Assad regime, but still there were some spies who worked for the regime. So that's also a taboo. There are many taboos. So I think the older generation, which would, for them, I think it would be a problem. This queer story, or Layla is gay, and that's this part of the story I think would be a problem. But so the older generation, like my aunt, for example, she could only write, and they cannot read that, so they would not read the book, so they cannot read from our community. So it's somehow also I could write about every taboo, and
they don't ask you about the details of your book?
No, they asked what it's about, and they know that I told my father. My father knows. I told him. I said, okay, maybe if it comes out, I don't know who talks and who reads it. Maybe there's a problem. And he said, okay, but that's reality. So you need to. So I have the support of my father, and you need to do that. And there are many queer Yazidi or Kurdish people in Germany, and for them it's also like sometimes when I said, okay, when I read this, I felt seen somehow. It's like, no, I could not talk about this reality, but it's a reality, and somehow they find some kind of support on reading the stories. So yeah.
In the reactions you got to your book, could you say that there was a clear divide between like the German reaction, the language in which it was first published, and then reactions to languages that were maybe accessible to other communities as well? Or would you say there's no difference?
No, it's very interesting. It's also when I read the book, or not only the book but the poems, there are some audience when they laugh because they think some things are funny, and the German, when there's only German audience, they never laugh somehow. They think everything is very tragic, but there are also some and I found this very interesting, what kind of humor, or what they think is funny or not, or there's some kind of also a bit all the family stories from Layla. There's also sometimes comic, and I think, and it really depends. But also in Germany, it's not. I cannot say that every German audience is the same. When I'm on the countryside, sometimes, or some people say it's a book about between two cultures. Some say it's a book about a family is like the political realities harm a family somehow or turn them apart, and it's about religious fundamentalism and the Yazidi and Kurdish history. So everyone reads their own book, so, and it also depends on the personal. So, for some, the queer aspect is, it's not a big part of the novel. It's there, but it's not the biggest part. So for some, they just overread it, I think. So it's really, it depends.
Last question from my side, and then I'd be happy to open it up if you have anything you would like to ask. Whoever follows you on Instagram can see that you keep a book diary of whatever you read. So I'm sure you're all going to read The Summers next, but I was wondering if after that you would like to recommend, it's a lit festival, no? What is one book you would like to suggest, maybe even from an Indian author?
Yeah. I read from Anuradha Roy, The Earth, and now I'm again, I read it in German, so I get The Earth, it's about making something out of
pottery, no?
Pottery, yeah.
Does anyone know the title in English?
I need to look it up. I looked it up before, but now I forgot it again. But I got a list I have now a list with books from India, and I need to read and read and read, yeah.
Perfect. Maybe the audience also wants to suggest some books for your...
yeah, I'm happy about
for your
reading recommendation. And
I'm sure you have questions for Ronya Othmann. Yes, there we go.
Thank you so much for, am I audible? Yes. Thank you so much for such a wonderful session, for reading aloud from your work and for the engaging questions. I had a question about translation. Could you please tell us a little bit about how it was having your book translated and how you felt about it and your participation in that? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So it's translated now in several languages, but this is the English version. It's the only translated version I can understand. So and it's very interesting because with some translators it's like a process. You talk and you have. And there was this social translating project of the Goethe-Institut I was part of. So there was a platform where translator could put questions. And with my, it's recently translated also in Dutch, and with my Dutch translator, I sent her pictures because she wanted to knew how the house looked and because sometimes one word can have in another language 3 meanings, and so they had detailed questions. But with the English translator, it was just, I knew, okay, someone will translate it or he will translate it, and then suddenly the book was there. Yeah, so sometimes it's like this, sometimes like this.
Is there a language you would really like to be translated in?
Yeah, someone wanted to, I have another text, but in Kurdish I would be happy because I would be interested because it's also about some Kurdish history, so yeah.
Thank you for your time. My question is, you mentioned something about memory is also fiction, right, which I can totally relate to, but when you're as part of your creative journey, do you feel like the writer or the reader in you wins? Is it the writer or the reader who's reading what you're writing, who wins, right? Because there could be a lot of layers that you would want to convey, right, when you're trying to talk about different layers, be it with any story, and much more, scope to, look at it from a migrant standpoint, and we're kind of using memory as an idea as well, right? There's just so much to choose from, right? So the writer in you may want to actually take a particular branch of that story, but then the reader in you may actually want to choose something conflicting or something minimizing or whatnot, right? So I'm trying to understand, how does that creative process work, and who wins and who do you think should win?
Yeah, I think every reader is somehow also a writer, because it's, yeah, I think you write your own book when you're reading it, and when I was writing it, so I had this documentary, like the stories of my father, and I don't know. Also, I read a lot, and in the next book it will be even more documentary as in this one. So yeah, I think it's a process somehow. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up, because I think that's an intriguing question. As an author, would you sacrifice facts for the better storytelling?
It depends. So no, in this, I think the historical facts, they need to be right somehow, because I cannot. And also there were some scenes I could not. I think I would sacrifice facts, but not like when I tell also there's a lot of violence, and I could not. This is also the violence described there is not fiction. So this is like the facts. This the stories I heard. And the next novel, I just finished it before I left Germany a few days ago, and so it's now it's a documentary novel about the genocide on the Yazidi people, and there is no it's a novel, but it's no fiction in it. There's everything is I can verify somehow, and it's because it's about the genocide on the Yazidi people, and I think it would be ethically not okay to like invent this like stage of violence. So I could, and also I cannot imagine something like this. The reality is worse than my imagination somehow. So in this case, I would not. I would stay with the facts, but the facts also are not the same in which order you tell something, with which language, and like the dramaturgy, like how you build it, or how you, if you work documentary, how you put it together. So this changes also the story. Even if the facts are the same, you can tell a different story. Yeah. So language is also very.
Any other questions? Then I will ask a question, because I'm really intrigued. I'm guessing that your next novel is more in the style of the text that was presented at Ingeborg Bachmann, so really kind of a literature document of something that has been happening, unfortunately, and that has not been widely received by a general audience. Are your books like two sides of a coin, or do you see them as completely different aspects of your life as an author?
I think I tell. So one thing I'm interested, like how do you tell violence? Also, like violence of, and it's yeah. I wrote a poetry collection which called "The Crimes." Is also about the same topic as the next book. So it's like the one is poetry, the other one is documentary novel, and this is like semi-documentary novel, but with a protagonist. And I think it's more like I don't build a story, but the story comes while writing, and also it's more like trying to understand something which could not be understood, and so that's the process of writing somehow. And I'm not finished with it, so I'm and trying to find a language, and with poetry you can tell some other aspects of something when you are inventing you have a protagonist, and or you have documentary, so it's somehow the same, but in a different, to come from another side and look from another side on it.
I'm anytime willing to hand over the microphone. If not, I'll just continue asking questions. So if you have something, please interrupt. I thought maybe it's also interesting, you actually studied creative writing, which in Germany there are a few institutions where you can study this at university. There are lots of countries where this is not the case, and where you have a completely different introduction to what is a writing process. Maybe you can say a bit about this, how you feel this has shaped becoming an author.
So there is this. In Germany, it was not very popular to study creative writing, but there was this institute in the GDR, like before like in East Germany, and there was one institute in in Russia, it was the it still exists, but it's not the same today. But Goethe-Institut, and then they founded in East Germany the Literature Institute. And we don't learn there how to write. It was more learning to read, and we read. Of course, we had some. It was to study somehow literature, but also we had some kind of seminars where we read we talked about our own text. But it was more to learn how to read, because I think they told us, for example, you cannot be a writer when you are not a reader somehow. So first you need to read and read and read and read. So that was the thing we learned there, and it's like a bit like studying art. For example, I have friends who went to art school, so it's maybe similar, yeah. And I think in the US it's also quite popular. Like the many writers from the US, they study creative writing. In England also, but in some countries it's like in Germany it was also a bit a discussion because of like the classic times. It was like they have this image of a genius or something, and then they said you cannot study it.
It's a gift. Either you have it or you don't have it.
It's a bit like this, but I think it's also a bit. I don't believe in this genius thing. I think it's really strange. They're always men.
I totally, yes. Do you have, I'm just picking up the topic, do you have any reading recommendations for our author, brilliant Indian women literature voices that she should come across? Really? Not one female author you can think of? That's on her list. Come on, we can't let the session end on this very sad note. There must be female genius. Thank you so much.
There's not just one I can tell you. That's the problem.
Oh, please.
That's why everyone is so silent. But in English, of course, there's Meena Kandasamy, a poet, and many authors in
between what you want to derive out of the writing process and what you want to articulate to the reader.
So, in the first question, can you repeat it? Okay. You got it. Yeah, I think in the individuality, it's not that thing, because every text sets its own rules somehow. So, and it was not like so everyone who studied there had a very different style of writing. So it was very like, sometimes you also copy sometimes what you also read, when I wrote poems, I wrote the poems. I read a lot of poems from the 16th century in Germany, and they have a very special rhythm in it. And I needed to stop reading these poems from the 16th century because I recognized that my own poems, they had this strange rhythm suddenly, even more and more, and I said, okay, I need to stop now. And this is always the danger. But like when you read something, when you read one thing all the time, then it comes also to your own. But I think that when we studied there, we had really different, like there were also people who were playwrights and people, students who wrote poetry, and some went more to essayistic writing, and also the styles and the topic were a big range somehow. So, and also the professors who they had like a really different styles. So it was, I think, it was not like one direction somehow. And the other question was if like the healing process.
Like how to strike a balance between what writing gives to you and what you want to articulate to the audience.
Yeah. I think, I don't know. I think to write also, even if it's like, sometimes it's a bit like, some people call this orthofictional writing, but I'm not sure, but it's like, to keep the distance is like somehow when you are writing about anything, it's you need to come very near into it, but also keep a distance while writing about it. So this is all the time in the process very important for me, how to keep the distance, to come really like in detail to something, but also keep the distance while that you can see the whole text as a text and things like that. So yeah.
I'm going to ask a very complicated last question, because I think this is an interesting aspect. And I mean, the stories you're telling, the community that you're related to, is a heavily traumatized community due to the political aspects. And there is this idea of writing as therapy and writing as distancing yourself from something that has happened. Has that been something that occurred to you, that this could have a healing aspect, or is that something that just outsiders would consider?
I think that has, for me it's like healing. This question, in Germany also often people ask this question, but for me it's not like, it has not that healing aspect or something, because you need to come again and again, and I think it would heal if the reality would change. For that would be a healing, but not writing about is not a healing for me. So, but if the situation for like when in the Middle East or also in the Iraq for Yazidi would become better, or for refugees who come to Europe, that would be a healing. But not writing is not a healing. Yeah. But still, I need literature somehow. To read other books, it's sometimes to keep sane. Yeah.
That's actually perfect last words. Ne? Read more literature to stay sane would be the last advice. Thank you so much for coming this morning. Thank you so much for a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.